Karen had finally fallen, but the scars she left on the community would linger for years. My cabin was safe, yet the battle had revealed just how far HOA power could be twisted by the wrong hands. And as neighbors whispered about other abuses, hiding in the shadows, one thing became clear: Karen might be gone. But the war against HOA corruption was only just beginning. The unexpected returnal deep within the pine-covered slopes of the Blue Ridge Mountains set a quiet little cabin, a place meant for peace and solitude. It wasn't grand, nor did it boast modern luxury, but it was mine, my retreat from the noise of daily life. I had purchased the cabin years ago as an escape, far from the watchful eyes of homeowners associations and the endless bickering of suburban neighborhoods. Or so I thought. Over time, the creeping shadow of the local HOA extended even into these hills, tightening its grip around the small community that had once thrived on independence and privacy. The figure at the center of that grip was a woman named Linda, though nobody called her that. To everyone in town, she was simply Karen. She had earned the title through years of ceaseless complaints, meddling, and a self-proclaimed authority that went far beyond her role as HOA president. She prided herself on dictating how cabins should look, when residents could host guests, and even how often trash bins should be rolled down the steep gravel roads. It wasn't just control she wanted, it was power, and she wielded it ruthlessly. For months, I had been away on business, traveling farther than I ever intended. Before leaving, I made sure my cabin was locked, utilities were paid, and no one had reason to step foot inside. The cabin was supposed to sit empty, awaiting my return. But little did I know, Karen had been watching closely, and in my absence, she had found a way to exploit what wasn't hers. It was a Friday afternoon when my schedule shifted unexpectedly. Meetings were canceled, and deadlines pushed back, granting me something rare: free time. I decided to seize the opportunity to retreat to the mountains earlier than planned, imagining nothing more dramatic than a weekend of quiet, firewood, and the whisper of wind through the trees. My truck climbed the winding back roads, tires crunching over gravel, as the golden light of late summer flickered between branches. At first glance, everything seemed ordinary. The entrance to the community looked the same, the familiar wooden sign still bearing the HOA's slogan about preserving beauty and order. Yet as I drew closer to my cabin, a subtle unease grew. The driveway wasn't empty. Multiple cars were parked haphazardly, tires cutting into the soft earth. I had deliberately kept natural. Some were sleek sedans with tinted windows, others SUVs stuffed with coolers and bags. This was no innocent visit. It looked like a gathering. My first instinct was confusion. Had I mistaken the address? No. The stone chimney, the faded shutters, the small porch swing, they were all mine. I pulled to the side of the road and cut the engine, my heart pounding harder than it should have. From inside, laughter spilled through the open windows, accompanied by the unmistakable thump of music. My quiet mountain retreat had been turned into a party house. As I stepped closer, trying to piece together the insanity of it all, a sharp, shrill voice pierced through the noise. It was Karen. She was in my cabin, her tone carrying the same authority she wielded at HOA meetings. Except this time she wasn't dictating lawn care. She was entertaining guests, people I didn't recognize. People sprawled across my porch, with drinks in hand, their shoes muddying the wooden boards. Anger surged, but confusion kept pace. Why was she here? How had she gained access? I had left the cabin locked. Yet here she was, acting as though the property were hers, playing hostess in what was supposed to be my sanctuary. I pushed forward, my presence finally catching the eye of someone near the porch. They froze, their cheerful expression dropping into wide-eyed panic before whispering something hurriedly to the others. Heads turned. Karen spun around, her face flushing red as recognition dawned. The moment our eyes met, her posture stiffened, and the false confidence she wore like armor cracked. But instead of shame or apology, she chose defiance. Her voice rose higher, shriller, and she clutched at her phone as though it were a weapon. Within seconds, she was screaming into it, her words sharp enough to cut through the air. She wasn't calling a neighbor. She was calling the police. The audacity was staggering. Here I was, the rightful owner of the cabin, and Karen, caught red-handed hosting strangers in my home, had the gall to frame me as the intruder, she shrieked, claims of trespassing, threats, and danger, as if I were some menace crashing her rightful gathering. Every syllable was laced with panic, but beneath it, I heard something else: fear of being exposed. The laughter and chatter from her so-called guests fell silent, replaced by an uneasy murmur. They watched, some embarrassed, others nervously sipping drinks, unsure whether to leave or wait. The mood had shifted dramatically, from a cheerful getaway to a scene of unfolding conflict. I stood motionless, my fists clenched at my sides, heart thundering in disbelief. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It wasn't an accident. Karen had planned this. She had used my cabin, paraded strangers through it, and when confronted, she attempted to twist reality itself by weaponizing authority. The sound of approaching sirens echoed faintly through the mountains, growing louder with each passing second. Karen's frantic gestures only intensified, pointing toward me with exaggerated flair. As though convincing herself of her own story, I remained still, knowing the truth would soon come to light, yet already sensing the uphill battle ahead, because in a world where Karen held sway, truth was never enough. And as the flashing lights came into view, bouncing off the trees and gravel, I realized this confrontation was only the beginning. When the police arrived, flashing blue and red lights washed over the trees, flickering across the dark wood siding of my cabin as the gravel road trembled. Beneath the weight of the approaching patrol car, the sound of sirens faded, replaced by the crunch of tires, then silence. For a brief moment, the only noise was the restless shifting of Karen's so-called guests. They stood scattered across my porch and yard, the earlier laughter and clinking of bottles gone, leaving only awkward glances and half-finished drinks abandoned on railings. Karen, however, wasted no time in amplifying her theatrics. She rushed toward the patrol car as though running into the arms of salvation. Her gestures were wild, her voice shrill, rising above the crickets and rustling trees. She pointed back toward me, words spilling out in rapid succession: trespasser, dangerous, aggressive, unstable. Each claim was more exaggerated than the last, and yet she spoke with the confidence of someone who believed authority was hers to command. The officers stepped out, scanning the scene with careful eyes. They were mountain deputies, used to quiet disputes, speeding tickets, and the occasional bear sighting near dumpsters. Yet now they were met with a woman in hysterics and a man standing rigidly still, fists at his sides, fury barely contained. I knew better than to move too quickly. In situations like this, perception was everything, and Karen was working overtime to paint me as the villain. I remained near my truck, the keys still visible in my hand, my posture calm though my heart pounded with rage. Every fiber of me wanted to shout, to demand why she was inside my home, but I swallowed the urge. This was no time for emotion. The deputies split their attention, one listening to Karen's torrent of accusations, the other walking toward me with cautious steps. Behind him, I could see the open door of my cabin, warm light spilling out onto the porch where strangers lounged uneasily. Their presence spoke louder than anything Karen could fabricate. Yet I knew lies had a way of twisting even the most obvious truths. Karen's voice carried through the night, describing me as a violent intruder who had stormed onto her property uninvited. She spun her tale with the skill of someone who had lied many times before and been believed. The word "her" slipped repeatedly from her lips: her cabin, her event, her guests. And every time she said it, something inside me clenched tighter. This wasn't a misunderstanding. She wasn't simply confused. She was trying to claim ownership of what wasn't hers. The deputy in front of me asked questions, measured and deliberate. My name, my reason for being here, whether I had identification to prove who I was. I provided everything calmly, pulling out my wallet with deliberate slowness, offering my license, my registration, even the deed copy I kept tucked in my glove compartment for emergencies. The documents bore my name, my signature, and the unmistakable address of the cabin behind us. Still, I could see hesitation flicker in the deputy's eyes. HOA disputes weren't unfamiliar in these mountains. He knew the type: neighbors weaponizing rules, presidents wielding authority like a sword. Yet the shrill insistence of someone like Karen could muddy the waters. Behind him, the second deputy attempted to calm her, but Karen wasn't slowing down. She demanded my arrest, claimed I had threatened her, insisted her guests were terrified. Her voice grew so loud it echoed through the trees, startling birds from their branches. Her audience of guests shifted uncomfortably, some clearly realizing they were caught in the middle of something far more sinister than a weekend getaway. Then came the turning point. The deputy near my truck asked if I had proof of ownership, beyond paperwork, something tangible, something immediate. I pointed to the cabin itself, describing in detail the items inside that no imposter could possibly know. The antique clock above the fireplace, the photograph of my late father on the mantel, the initials I had carved into the underside of the porch swing the day I first bought the place. The officer listened, then signaled his partner. The second deputy attempted to calm her, but Karen wasn't slowing down. She demanded my arrest, claimed I had threatened her, insisted her guests were terrified. Her voice grew so loud it echoed through the trees, startling birds from their branches. Her audience of guests shifted uncomfortably, some clearly realizing they were caught in the middle of something far more sinister than a weekend getaway. Then came the turning point. The deputy near my truck asked if I had proof of ownership beyond paperwork, something tangible, something immediate. I pointed to the cabin itself, describing in detail the items inside that no imposter could possibly know. The antique clock above the fireplace, the photograph of my late father on the mantel, the initials I had carved into the underside of the porch swing the day I first bought the place. The officer listened, then signaled his partner. The second deputy stepped into the cabin, leaving Karen fuming outside, her face twisted with indignation. Moments later, he returned with a single, framed photograph in his hand, the same picture of my father I had described. He studied it, compared it to me, and nodded silently. The truth was irrefutable. Karen's expression faltered for the briefest second, panic flashing across her face before she doubled down, claiming I had planted the evidence, that this was part of some elaborate scheme to steal her property. Her lies grew desperate, tangled in contradictions, each one more absurd than the last. The deputies exchanged glances, patience thinning. Finally, they turned their attention to the crowd of strangers who had been lingering uncomfortably on my porch. When asked, none of them could provide a reasonable explanation for why they were there. Some admitted they had been invited under the impression that Karen was renting the cabin out. Others claimed ignorance, saying they had only followed a friend's invitation. None could deny, however, that they had been staying in a property that was not hers to offer. The realization began to sink in. This wasn't a harmless oversight or misunderstanding. Karen had been using my cabin likely for weeks, maybe even months, treating it as though it were her own personal airbun, and worse, she had leveraged her HOA authority to silence anyone who might question it, weaponizing fear and rules against her neighbors. The deputies, now firmly convinced of the truth, ordered the guests to gather their belongings and leave immediately. Some hurried off without argument, while others lingered in shame, muttering apologies as they carried bags down the porch steps. My once quiet retreat was left in disarray. Mud tracked across the floors, bottles littered on tables, cushions out of place, the air heavy with the stench of smoke and alcohol. Karen, however, refused to back down. She ranted about legal technicalities, threatened lawsuits, and shrieked at the deputies as though they were disobedient children. When told to leave, she screamed louder, her voice breaking as her carefully constructed illusion of control collapsed. As she was finally escorted down the driveway, still clutching her phone, still spitting venom, I stood silently on the porch of my desecrated cabin. Relief washed through me, but it was thin, fragile, overshadowed by a deeper unease. Because even as the police cars carried Karen away, I knew this battle was far from over. Karen wasn't the type to surrender. She would twist the narrative, find allies, and strike back harder than before. And in a community ruled by HOA politics and whispered rumors, she still had the power to make my life miserable. The cabin was mine, the truth undeniable. But this wasn't the end. It was only the first crack in a much larger war. The HOA Strikes Back morning after the confrontation was eerily quiet. The mountain air, usually so crisp and calming, felt heavy with the weight of what had transpired. My cabin, though standing tall, bore the scars of invasion. The porch still smelled faintly of beer, ash from a late-night fire lingered in the air, and the once pristine living room now looked like a battlefield of careless indulgence. Empty bottles littered the shelves, cushions were overturned, and the faint outline of muddy footprints stained the hardwood floors. I spent the early hours cleaning, trying to reclaim some semblance of normalcy, but every sweep of the broom and every trash bag filled with remnants of strangers carried the same bitter reminder. Karen had violated my sanctuary. She hadn't just crossed a boundary, she had bulldozed through it and invited the world inside. By mid-morning, the quiet shattered with the sound of gravel crunching under tires. A white SUV pulled into my driveway, its polished surface gleaming beneath the sunlight. On the door was the HOA's emblem, an oak leaf wrapped in a circle, an image meant to symbolize unity, but now felt like the mark of intrusion. A man stepped out, suit pressed, clipboard in hand. He wasn't here to apologize or check on my well-being. He was here with purpose. His tone was polite, but his words carried the unmistakable weight of bureaucracy. He handed me a thick envelope, stamped with the HOA's seal. Inside were letters, formal notices citing alleged violations. The irony was almost laughable. Karen had been caught red-handed trespassing, but somehow the HOA had turned its gaze on me. According to their paperwork, I had failed to maintain community standards. The list was absurd. Grass too long near the roadside, paint on the cabin's shutters beginning to fade, an unapproved use of property during the incident the night before, and the most insulting of all, a fine for disrupting community peace and safety. The language was sterile, yet the intent was clear. Karen was still pulling strings. Even escorted off my property by police, she had managed to weaponize her role as HOA president, shifting the narrative and making me out to be the villain. I stood on the porch with the papers in hand, the representative's rehearsed apology ringing hollow in my ears. He left quickly, unwilling to linger, as though proximity to conflict might tarnish him. And just like that, the war had begun. The rest of the day unfolded like a calculated attack. Emails poured in from the HOA, each one citing another rule, another complaint. Some were trivial, bordering on ridiculous. A neighbor had reported that my trash bins weren't aligned properly with the road. Another claimed my cabin's firewood stack was unsightly. It was clear these weren't genuine concerns. They were orchestrated, a campaign designed to bury me under red tape and fines until I either yielded or broke. What unsettled me most, however, wasn't the HOA itself but the whispers traveling through the community. I heard them when I drove into town for supplies, felt the stares from familiar faces who suddenly looked at me differently. Rumors had spread fast, stories of a man who had barged into someone else's property, of a dangerous confrontation with police, of a temper that made him unfit for the community. Karen's version of events had taken root. It was astonishing how quickly perception could shift. Neighbors I had once shared friendly nods with now crossed the street to avoid me. Some muttered under their breath, while others simply shook their heads, their silence more damning than words. The betrayal cut deep. Karen had not only violated my home, but poisoned the very soil of the community around me. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about my cabin. She had been using her power for years, bending rules to her will, silencing those who opposed her, and punishing anyone who dared stand in her way. I was simply the latest target, but unlike others, I wasn't going to bend. That night, as the mountains fell into shadow, I sat at my desk with a single lamp casting light across the pile of documents the HOA had delivered. I read each line carefully, noting contradictions, inconsistencies, and overreach. Every rule they cited, every complaint they filed, became fuel. I wasn't simply going to defend myself, I was going to expose her. The more I pieced things together, the clearer the picture became. Karen had likely been renting out my cabin for months, pocketing the money under the guise of HOA-sanctioned guest use. She had built a system that blurred the line between her authority and personal gain, using fear to keep neighbors from questioning it. The incident with me wasn't her first abuse of power, it was just the one she couldn't fully control. As midnight approached, I gathered every bit of evidence. I had photographs of the trashed cabin, receipts proving my absence, the deed showing my ownership. I even had the police report from the night before, listing me as the rightful owner and Karen as the trespasser. It wasn't much, but it was a foundation. Still, I knew evidence alone wouldn't win. Karen's true weapon wasn't rules or paperwork, it was influence. She thrived on shaping the narrative, twisting perception until people believed her lies. To win, I needed to do more than prove the truth. I needed to dismantle her power at its roots. The first step was to turn the HOA's own tactics against them. Every letter, every fine, every absurd complaint, they would become ammunition in my case. I would document it all, exposing the harassment for what it truly was. But beyond that, I needed allies, people who had suffered under Karen's reign, but had been too afraid to speak up. Somewhere in this community, there were others who had seen her for what she was, and if I could bring them together, I wouldn't just defend my cabin. I would bring down the empire Karen had built. As I looked out into the darkness, the mountains stretching endlessly beyond the window, I felt the first spark of resolve burn within me. Karen had declared war, but she underestimated me, and I was ready to fight back, gathering the allies. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope. Every sunrise brought new notices stuffed into my mailbox, each one dripping with HOA jargon and fabricated infractions. Karen's shadow loomed over every page, her influence seeping through the legal language, but I refused to bow under the weight. Instead, I documented everything, photographing letters, logging dates, and creating a meticulous record of the harassment. Yet I knew paper alone wouldn't win the war. Karen had spent years cultivating fear in the community, her voice carrying the weight of the HOA like a weapon. She thrived not because people liked her, but because they were afraid of her. If I wanted to dismantle her empire, I needed to break that fear. So I began searching for others who had been burned by her tyranny. The first stop was the retired couple who lived 2 cabins down from me, Henry and Margaret. They had always kept to themselves, tending their garden quietly, waving politely when our paths crossed. Rumors had swirled months earlier that Karen fined them over an unapproved bird feeder. At the time, it seemed absurd, but now I recognized it as part of her pattern, targeting the vulnerable, making examples of them. When I knocked on their door, hesitation filled their eyes. Years of being under Karen's thumb had made them wary of trust. But when I explained what had happened at my cabin, something shifted. Anger, long suppressed, bubbled to the surface. They shared their story of harassment, how Karen had fined them endlessly, berated them at meetings, and even threatened to take their home to preserve community standards. They had kept quiet out of fear, but seeing Karen finally challenged lit a spark in them. They agreed to help, though cautiously, their voices trembling with both fear and hope. From there, I sought out others. There was Daniel, a single father, whose teenage son had once parked his car slightly over the community's painted lines. Karen had turned the mistake into a spectacle, demanding hundreds in fines and threatening to ban his son from using the shared roads. Daniel had paid, humiliated, afraid of escalation, but he hadn't forgotten. Then came Marissa, a young woman who had inherited her late aunt's cabin. Karen had nearly driven her out, insisting she repaint the siding at a cost far beyond her means. She spoke of the shame, the tears, and the sense of helplessness Karen instilled. But now, like the others, she saw an opportunity for justice. As slowly, piece by piece, a coalition formed. Each story painted the same picture: a community suffocated under Karen's reign, cowed into submission by her ruthless control. And now, with my evidence and their testimonies, we had the makings of a case strong enough to challenge her authority. But allies alone weren't enough. Karen had mastered the art of narrative. She knew how to spin lies into truth, how to make victims look like aggressors. If we wanted to succeed, we needed to fight her where she was strongest, in the court of community opinion. So I devised a plan. The HOA's monthly meeting was approaching, a gathering where Karen reigned supreme, her voice dominating the room. While neighbors nodded in fearful agreement, it was there she solidified her control, manipulating rules and silencing dissent. but it was also the one place where the entire community gathered, the perfect stage to expose her. I spent the week preparing meticulously. Every photo, every police report, every letter and fine, I organized into binders. I collected written statements from my new allies, detailing their experiences in painstaking detail, and I rehearsed over and over how I would present the truth. The night of the meeting arrived, tension hanging in the air like a storm. The community hall, usually half empty, buzzed with chatter. Word of the incident at my cabin had spread, twisted through Karen's filter, and everyone was eager to hear what would happen next. Karen sat at the head of the room, posture rigid, lips curled into the faintest of smirks. She thrived on spectacle, confident that she could bend the narrative in her favor. Her gavel tapped against the table, calling the meeting to order, her voice cutting through the chatter like a blade. But as the meeting progressed, something was different. Eyes shifted toward me, whispers circling. When the time came for community concerns, I stood, binder in hand, heart pounding. Karen's smirk widened, expecting a futile protest she could easily dismantle. But as I spoke, the room shifted. I presented the facts, piece by piece. The police report proving ownership of my cabin, the photographs of the damage left behind by her guests, the letters from neighbors detailing her abuse of power. Each revelation struck like a hammer, the weight of truth breaking through the fog of fear she had cast. Murmurs spread, louder now, filled with disbelief and anger. People who had once stayed silent were now emboldened, nodding, whispering, daring to speak. I could see Karen's composure faltering, cracks forming in her carefully constructed facade. She tried to interrupt, to dismiss my claims, but every word she spoke was met with skepticism. For the first time, the community wasn't blindly following her. They were questioning. By the time I finished, the room no longer belonged to Karen. It belonged to the truth. The allies I had gathered stood beside me, their voices trembling, but strong as they confirmed their stories. One after another, they spoke of fines, harassment, and humiliation. The narrative Karen had built was unraveling in real time, slipping from her grasp no matter how tightly she tried to hold it. Her gavel slammed against the table, her voice rising in desperation. She called us liars, conspirators, outsiders trying to tear down her community. But her words no longer carried the same weight. The tide had turned. As the meeting adjourned, the hall buzzed with new energy. Neighbors approached me quietly, some offering support, others admitting they too had suffered under Karen's control, but had been too afraid to speak. What had once been a fractured, fearful group was beginning to unite, but victory was not yet complete. Karen was cornered, but not defeated, and people like her didn't go down quietly. That night, as I walked back to my cabin, the cool mountain air filling my lungs, I knew the hardest part was still ahead. Karen would strike back, harder and dirtier than before, and I had to be ready. Karen's desperation. Karen had always thrived on control. It was the foundation of her identity, the fuel that kept her going. But after the community meeting, that foundation had begun to crumble. The whispers that once empowered her now cut like knives. Neighbors who once lowered their eyes when she passed now dared to look her in the face. And the glimmer of fear she saw in their stares had shifted into something else, defiance. For Karen, this was intolerable. And like any tyrant watching her power slip, she lashed out with desperation. The retaliation began almost immediately. Within days of the meeting, the HOA office flooded my mailbox with even more notices. Fines escalated, the language grew sharper, and the threats of legal action loomed heavier. The absurdity reached new heights. Accusations that my chimney was too tall, that my cabin's curtains were the wrong shade, that the sound of my truck driving up the gravel road constituted noise. Pollution. It was harassment in its purest form, a paper war designed to overwhelm and exhaust. But instead of breaking me, each letter only hardened my resolve. I added them to the growing pile of evidence, knowing that every overreach only strengthened my case against her. But Karen wasn't content with paperwork. She wanted spectacle. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, I returned to my cabin to find spray-painted words scrawled across the side of my porch, "Outsider." The letters were crude, dripping with anger, the kind of vandalism meant to scare rather than damage. My stomach churned, not from fear, but from the confirmation that Karen was slipping further into recklessness. The next day, neighbors reported seeing Karen prowling the roads late at night, flashlight in hand, jotting notes into a little book she carried. She was searching for ammunition, any scrap of supposed violation she could turn against me or anyone who dared align with me. Her desperation had made her sloppy, and slowly, she was losing credibility with even her most loyal supporters. But desperation also made her dangerous. 2 weeks after the meeting, a new notice arrived, heavier than the rest. It wasn't a simple fine or a hollow threat. It was a formal letter of intent. The HOA, under Karen's direction, was moving to foreclose on my cabin. Their justification? Repeated and ongoing violations of community standards, unpaid fines, and disruptive behavior threatening the harmony of the neighborhood. It was absurd, illegal even. But Karen was betting on one thing, that I wouldn't have the stamina or resources to fight back. She wanted me gone, erased. My cabin absorbed back into her control so she could continue her schemes unchecked. The move sent shockwaves through the community. Some whispered that Karen had finally gone too far. Others, still under her spell, believed her narrative that I was a danger, a troublemaker who didn't belong. The battle lines were no longer just drawn, they were deep trenches cutting through the neighborhood. I wasn't about to let her win. With my allies beside me, I doubled down. We organized quietly, sharing stories, compiling documents, gathering every shred of evidence that painted the full picture of Karen's corruption. We weren't just fighting for my cabin anymore, we were fighting for everyone she had wronged, for every neighbor she had bullied into silence. But Karen sensed the resistance growing, and as her grip slipped further, she reached for the only weapon left to her: chaos. I woke to the sound of sirens again. Red and blue lights bounced across my cabin walls, the sharp crackle of radios piercing the silence. I rushed outside to find fire trucks in the driveway, their hoses unwinding, firefighters sprinting toward the side of my cabin. Smoke curled faintly from a pile of brush stacked near the porch, set ablaze deliberately. Though extinguished before it spread. It wasn't an accident. It was a warning. The fire chief pulled me aside, his tone cautious, but clear. Someone had tried to start a fire, and if it hadn't been caught early, the cabin would have gone up in flames. My retreat, my inheritance, my sanctuary, all reduced to ash. Though they couldn't prove who was behind it, I didn't need evidence to know. This had Karen's fingerprints all over it. When control slipped from her grasp, she didn't just fight, she burned. The incident shook the community harder than anything before. Even those who had once defended Karen whispered now of fear, of lines crossed that could no longer be ignored. For the first time, her power was cracking, not just from pressure, but from disgust. Yet Karen herself remained defiant. She doubled down in meetings, screeched at neighbors in the street, accused me of staging the fire to frame her. Her desperation had tipped her from cunning manipulator into unhinged tyrant. And the more she flailed, the more people began to see her for what she truly was. The foreclosure notice still hung over my head like a guillotine. But the tide had turned. I wasn't just defending myself anymore, I was building the case to bring her down completely. The vandalism, the harassment, the lies, the trespassing, even the attempted arson, they were all threads in the same tapestry. A picture of corruption, too large to ignore. I knew the next step was inevitable. This wasn't going to end with letters or meetings. It was heading to court. And in a courtroom, with evidence laid bare, Karen would finally be stripped of the power she clung to so desperately. The war wasn't over yet, but for the first time, I could see victory on the horizon. The fall of Carenthi Courthouse sat at the edge of town, a modest brick building that had seen decades of small disputes and local hearings. But on the day of Karen's reckoning, its halls buzzed with an unusual energy. Neighbors filled the benches, their whispers echoing against the walls. Some came out of loyalty to her, still clinging to the myth of her authority. Others came out of curiosity, eager to watch the collapse of a woman who had ruled their lives for far too long. And there I stood at the center of it all, binder in hand, my allies beside me. The sleepless nights of preparation, the endless harassment, the vandalism, the fire, all of it had led here. Karen entered the courtroom like a queen stripped of her crown, yet still pretending it rested on her head. She wore her defiance like armor, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her eyes darting around as though she still expected everyone to bow. But the glares and murmurs that followed her path told a different story. The fear she had once commanded had curdled into resentment. The judge presided with measured authority. Unmoved by her theatrics, the case before him was clear. The HOA, under Karen's leadership, sought foreclosure of my cabin. My counterclaim accused her of trespass, harassment, abuse of authority, and orchestrating the misuse of HOA funds for personal gain. It began with her attorney's presentation, a carefully spun web of accusations. They painted me as a disruptive outsider, a man who didn't respect community rules, who resisted the standards meant to protect property values. They leaned heavily on the stack of violation notices, each one framed as evidence of my supposed disregard for order. But when my turn came, the tide shifted. I presented everything. The police report proving ownership of my cabin, photographs of the damage from Karen's unauthorized parties, the vandalism scrawled across my porch, the fire report detailing the suspicious blaze set against my home. I stacked the HOA's endless notices side by side, exposing their absurdity, showing the escalation from petty fines to foreclosure. And then, one by one, my allies took the stand. Henry and Margaret spoke softly but firmly, their voices trembling as they recounted the years of harassment, fines for bird feeders, threats over their garden, nights spent in fear of losing their home. Daniel described how Karen had humiliated his teenage son, turning a parking mistake into a campaign of shame. Marissa broke down in tears as she described how Karen had nearly driven her from her aunt's cabin, demanding renovations far beyond her means. Each story landed like a blow. Together, they formed a chorus of truth too powerful to dismiss. The room fell silent as the weight of Karen's corruption settled like a storm cloud overhead. Karen, desperate, couldn't contain herself. She interrupted constantly, her voice rising, her face flushed. She accused us all of lying, claimed we were conspiring against her, even turned on her own supporters, berating them when they failed to defend her as loudly as she demanded. The judge, patient at first, grew stern. He warned her once, then again, before finally silencing her with the firm strike of his gavel. Her outbursts had crossed the line from defiance into contempt. By the end of the hearing, the truth was undeniable. The foreclosure motion was dismissed outright. The judge ruled that the HOA, under Karen's leadership, had grossly overstepped its authority. An independent audit was ordered to investigate the misuse of funds, and Karen herself was stripped of her position as HOA president effective immediately. The gavel fell one last time, sealing her fate. The aftermath was swift. News spread through the community like wildfire. For years, Karen had been the iron fist around their throats, the voice that dictated every aspect of their lives. Now she was reduced to nothing more than a disgraced figure, her influence shattered. Neighbors who once cowered before her now spoke freely, their relief palpable. Some even celebrated openly, toasting to the end of her reign. As for Karen, her descent was rapid and brutal. Without her title, she lost the only power she had ever truly possessed. Whispers of financial fraud and misuse of HOA funds followed her, investigations digging into her dealings. Her so-called friends melted away, unwilling to be associated with her downfall, and in the end, she was left alone. A bitter reminder of what happens when control turns into obsession. I returned to my cabin not as a victim, but as a victor. The damage she had caused would take time to repair: the stains on the floor, the scorch marks near the porch, the mistrust that lingered in the community. But for the first time in months, peace felt possible again. The cabin stood strong against the backdrop of the mountains, its weathered wood glowing in the afternoon sun. It had endured trespassers, vandalism, lies, and fire, yet it remained standing, just as I had. Neighbors stopped by in the days that followed, some offering apologies for believing Karen's lies, others thanking me for standing up when they couldn't. The fear she had planted for years was finally uprooted, replaced with something far more powerful: unity. Karen had called the cops screaming when I returned early, thinking she could twist the story in her favor. She had weaponized lies, manipulated power, and even tried to burn me out. But in the end, truth had stripped her bare, and as I sat on the porch swing one evening, the initials I had carved long ago still etched beneath the wood, I realized something important. Karen hadn't just been defeated for me, she had been defeated for everyone she had ever tried to control. The mountains were quiet again. My cabin was mine, and Karen's reign of terror was over.